Was the Roman Empire really built on debt? When we think of the Roman Empire, the first things that come to mind are disciplined legions, legendary generals, and unstoppable conquests. But there's one question most people never stop to ask. Who paid for all of it? Because keeping an army of thousands in the field for years wasn't possible through courage alone. Every soldier had to be fed. Weapons had to be forged. Armor needed constant repairs. Horses had to be cared for. Roads had to be built, bridges constructed, and siege engines transported. None of that came for free. In fact, Rome's greatest weapon wasn't its sharp swords. It was its financial system. And here's the most fascinating part. Once you understand how Rome financed its wars, you begin to look at the modern world through a completely different lens, because although 2,000 years have passed, the underlying logic hasn't changed as much as we might think. Let's start from the beginning. During the early years of the Roman Republic, the army wasn't professional in the modern sense. Citizens who owned land were called to serve, brought their own equipment, fought when needed, and then returned to their farms once the campaign was over. For small, short wars, this system worked well, but as Rome expanded, everything changed. New territories were conquered, battlefronts moved farther away, and wars lasted years instead of weeks. A farmer couldn't simply leave his land behind for several years. Rome needed full-time soldiers, and full-time soldiers meant regular salaries. This was the moment when the Roman state took direct responsibility for financing its military. At first, those expenses were manageable. But as the empire grew larger, military costs increased dramatically. That's when Rome came up with what seemed like a brilliant solution. Every new conquest would finance the next one. Captured cities became new taxpayers. Mines were absorbed into the imperial treasury. Slaves entered the economy as labor. Ports generated new trade revenues. War wasn't just expanding territory, it was generating income. That's why Rome's expansion wasn't merely a political ambition. It became the foundation of its economic model. And this is where the system revealed its greatest weakness. To keep generating revenue, Rome had to keep conquering. If expansion stopped, the money stopped too. That was the beginning of a trap that many great powers throughout history would eventually fall into. And Rome didn't rely on taxes alone. During major wars, the government frequently borrowed money from wealthy families and the financial elite of the time. These people weren't lending money out of patriotism. They were investing. In return, they earned interest, received tax collection rights, and gained valuable commercial privileges in newly conquered territories. In other words, war had become an extremely profitable business for certain people. The longer the war, the greater the profits. Over time, the state and private wealth became deeply connected. The army fought. The financial elite provided the money. The state conquered new lands. And everyone involved continued to benefit. At least while the system kept working. But no economy can expand forever. Eventually, there are fewer lands left to conquer. New sources of revenue begin to disappear. Yet the expenses remain. And that's exactly where Rome started running into trouble. Soldiers still had to be paid. Debts still had to be honored. Government spending continued. But the money flowing into the treasury was no longer growing at the same pace. So the rulers turned to a solution that still sounds familiar today. They reduced the value of the currency. Beginning during Emperor Nero's reign, the silver content of the denarius was gradually reduced. The coins looked exactly the same from the outside, but they were worth less with every new issue. At first few people noticed, but over time, More money entered circulation. Prices began to rise. What we now call inflation slowly spread throughout the Roman economy. People received the same wages, but those wages bought less and less. Sound familiar? And the consequences weren't shared equally. The wealthy protected their fortunes through land, trade, and valuable assets. Ordinary citizens weren't so fortunate. Taxes increased. Purchasing power declined. Military obligations became heavier. Most of the economic burden fell on the lower classes. Rome's crisis wasn't just military, it was financial. Now let's take a moment and look at the present. Modern governments also run massive budget deficits. Many wars are financed not through current tax revenues, but through borrowing. Central banks inject new money into the economy when necessary. Inflation regularly returns as one of the biggest economic concerns. Of course, we don't live in ancient Rome. Today's financial systems are far more complex. Technology, global trade, and financial markets have transformed the world. But some of the underlying mechanisms remain surprisingly familiar. Government spending increases. Debt grows. New revenue sources are constantly sought. And much of the financial burden eventually spreads across ordinary people. That's why history isn't only valuable for understanding the past. It's one of the best tools for understanding the present. Rome teaches us one fundamental lesson. If an economic system depends on endless expansion, eventually it reaches its limits. Growth slows, but expectations remain. Debt remains, spending remains, and the pressure begins building from within. Throughout history, many great powers struggled for exactly this reason, because sometimes the greatest threat isn't an enemy outside the gates. It's the economic model built inside them. So the next time you hear about another financial crisis, another war, or another government announcing a $1 trillion spending package, don't just read the headlines. Ask yourself one question. Where is the money coming from? Who is lending it? Who is profiting? And in the end, who is really paying the bill? Because perhaps the greatest lesson financial history has to offer is this. Empires don't always fall because an enemy breaks through their walls. Sometimes they fall because decades of unsustainable economic decisions finally catch up with them. And here's the interesting part. History rarely repeats itself exactly. But it has an uncanny habit of rhyming. That's why one of the best ways to understand the future is to understand how money moved in the past. Because when you follow the money, you inevitably begin to follow power as well. If this video gave you a new perspective, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to Money and History. Because history isn't just about the past. It's the key to understanding the present and preparing for the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.